Hey, what's up, guys? How you doing? It's me, Mr. 4Cap Scaler. Anthem Xbox One X version on my OLED, and yes, it does support HDR. There's no question about that. It does have HDR. It's being processed. It's right here. Clearly, you can see it. There's the HDR right there. Okay, it does have HDR, but how good is this of an HDR? Well, that's where I am a little bit disappointed. It's just the tone mapping just doesn't pop. HDR is supposed to be about that dynamic picture quality, that dynamic contrast between the white bright levels and deep dark levels, and that color gamut to be more natural. But I don't see that here. I just don't see that here, especially on this television, on this OLED. And the worst part is this: there is no HDR slider. That's what really disappoints me. Now, don't get me wrong, the tone mapping, it's not like Red Dead Redemption type of a tone mapping. It's not a bad, horrible tone mapping. But I just feel that there's that HDR dynamic picture that's missing. Those of you who know how a true excellent tone mapping is on the HDR, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. And there's two indications that the HDR, it's just not looking its best here. Number one, there is no HDR slider, paper white for the white digital bright levels, and of course for the black digital levels. You don't have neither of those sliders available. HDR should have two sliders as a standard, but they're not being implemented here. Now, if this game had an excellent tone mapping, if this game had an excellent HDR, in my opinion, you wouldn't even need that slider. But I think every HDR game should have the two sliders. It doesn't feel the way I think it could have been. It just doesn't look the way it could have been, and this is one of the issues that I'm having here. And there's no HDR slider, as I'm going to show it to you in a minute. Um, it has a decent, I would say, decent tone mapping, but there's just it's too bland. Like I said, it doesn't have that three-dimensional HDR look to it. For those of you who have seen a real good HDR with a real good tone mapping, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This game, it's just the HDR container here is just very poorly imp- implemented, in my opinion. And here's problem. This is the problem, man. It almost looks as if they're using some sort of an HDR that's being compressed, like a compressed HDR. Like it's almost like they're compressing that uh, container of HDR with static metadata, and they're just overlapping it. I don't want to use the word fake HDR, and I think this is where people are going to say, oh, here we go again. Again, I'm trying to stay away from the word fake HDR. I don't want to say it's a fake HDR, but sometimes I don't know how else to call it. I don't know how else to call it. Where's the HDR slider? Give me that HDR slider. Let me determine for myself as to how much of that lumen's peak brightness do I need to adjust. The only thing you have here is the brightness, and the brightness is okay. I leave it at 50 for the OLED. For the QLED, I would leave it at 50 as well too. I wouldn't mess around with it. Um, it's just disappointing, that this game doesn't have that good of an HDR. You know, every game needs to have an HDR slider. Uh, if you look at this game and you look at the Crackdown 3, it's like night and day. It's like Crackdown 3 just blows this game out of the water with its HDR. If you look at for example, Assassin's Creed, Odyssey, it's like blows this game out of the water with the HDR. You look at Forza Horizon 4, it just dominates in HDR in every aspect. It's just a poor tone mapping. And it also makes me wonder, did I have a feeling that here's what I think. Here's what I think, and you guys can prove me wrong if you want. I don't care. I honestly think that they didn't work on the HDR for this game. I think they just compressed the HDR, put it in the SDR container, and used that static metadata, and they just kind of compressed it into the HDR. They used the SDR and they compressed it into the HDR container. Again, I don't want to use the word fake HDR, but it's leading to that almost. It's just not that good, man. Because here's the thing, if they had spent time and implemented a really good HDR, it would have showed with a much better tone mapping. It would have showed with much better controls on the lumens brightness, paper white, and of course the deep dark levels, black digital levels adjustments as well. But we don't see that here. We don't see any slider adjustments. We don't see HDR anywhere. And I think they're probably using a fake method. They're compressing it. It's kind of similar to on the Apple TV. You know, like when you switch to the Apple TV 4K and on your user interface that's 8-bit, you just turn that HDR and just compress it. They're just compressing. They're compressing the standard dynamic range with HDR. So in other words, I think it's a fake HDR. I'm pretty sure Evil Boris will do a much better job with this. He's gonna go through it. He's gonna dissect it. I'm sure John Crow will contact him as well. But my opinion here is that this is not it's not a good HDR, man. And this is a really good TV. This is an OLED, man. All right, this is not some run down the mill, crappy television. This is OLED, and this is not good, man. These are not good deep dark levels. This is not good dynamic picture quality that you would expect from an HDR. There's no HDR slider, so I know that they did a piss poor job in terms of the HDR here. That's why they patched it up so quickly in hope that people will think that, oh, there's HDR and they won't tell a difference. But professionals who have equipment, they'll probably measure the tone mapping. They'll see if the tone mapping it's properly indicated. I guarantee you they did not work on the HDR on this game. And now the last minute call, they put it in and they compressed it and it looks worse than ever. I think you're better off just turning off the HDR. Honestly. I think you're better off just turning the HDR off here. I'm going to wait to see what Evil Boris says. Let him do his thing. Let him dissect this whole thing. He's got the equipment. I don't have the equipment. He's got the software. Let him check the tone mapping. Let him see how the tone mapping is. If it's good, if it's bad. But I guarantee you, even he is going to find the conclusion that the tone mapping is just not that good. And I have my OLED light and my contrast light set to the maximum. Okay, and there is no HDR slider. So that tells me right there, if there's no HDR slider, that tells me right there that this is really not a... This is a... I guess I have to call it fake HDR. I guess I have no choice now. I have to call it fake. I guess I have to call it fake. It's a compressed HDR, and there it is. It's a compressed. There it is right there. HDR. It's a compressed HDR. That's what it is. And yet again, EA. You really just... EA should get the Academy Awards of disappointment. With every game they release, it's just disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. Why can't you guys... why is it difficult for these companies? They've been working on this game for a long time. Why can't you have a set of 4 people in a department of development of the HDR tone mapping for this game? Let them just work on the HDR and let them implement a proper tone mapping with 2 sliders so that way we can have a really good HDR. This game deserves HDR, deserves a real HDR, because this game has great environments, and I think it could greatly benefit from that HDR. But sadly, that's not the case. Well, anyway, this is my opinion. Okay, guys, I don't have the equipment, I don't have the software to check the tone mapping. Evil Boris HDR, he has that. I'll wait for him to see what he says. But looking at it, and this is a E8, this is OLED, this is E8, this is a really good TV, and I can tell you that the HDR here, it's like almost you're better off turning it off. Just turn it off, dude. There's no slider, there's just brightness. It tells me it's a fake HDR. It tells me it's a compressed HDR. You're better off just turning it off. Seriously. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I guess I have to call it fake HDR. I mean, I don't know how. I mean, that's it, I guess. I have no choice. I have to call it. I'm guilty of it too. I'm sorry, but sometimes there's no other way of calling it except it is what it is. A fake HDR. All right, guys. Have a good one, though. But you let me know, what do you guys think? What are your thoughts on it?